There is a quiet moment happening right now that almost no one is talking about. A moment where the people who once carried the weight of society are no longer lifting it. Not because they cannot, but because they were told for decades to put it down. What happens when the group that was blamed for everything finally decides to stop fixing anything at all? What happens when they step back, pour a drink, sit down, and watch the system wobble under its own contradictions? Stay with me until the end of this video, because what I'm about to explain is not just about men, it is about the future of modern society itself. If you appreciate direct conversations like this and you want more content that cuts through noise and distractions, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you never miss a single Angry Guy video the moment it goes live. Before we go any further, I want to remind you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets, grow your wealth responsibly, and understand how to buy, sell, and trade crypto in a clear and structured way, the Academy is built specifically for that purpose. Go check it out now through the link in the description and take control of your financial future instead of leaving it in the hands of systems that do not prioritize you. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support for the work that goes into making them, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to support the channel and help keep this content coming. Now, let us talk about what is really happening, because beneath the headlines, beneath the constant distractions, beneath the endless arguments designed to keep everyone divided, there is a slow, steady withdrawal taking place. Millions of men are not protesting, not marching, not demanding attention, and not trying to correct the direction of society anymore. They are simply stepping away. Over 50 million working age men have exited the workforce in the United States alone, and that number continues to grow. This is not a temporary trend. It is not a phase, and it is not the result of laziness or lack of opportunity. It is the result of a long cultural conversation that told men repeatedly and clearly that they were the problem, that their presence was harmful, that their instincts were outdated, and that their contributions were either unnecessary or suspect. When someone is told for decades that they are not wanted, eventually they believe it, and belief turns into action, or in this case, inaction. For years, men were told to step back, to be quieter, to suppress their nature, to avoid risk, to avoid interaction, to avoid leadership, and to avoid responsibility unless explicitly invited. They were warned that approaching was inappropriate, that ambition was dangerous, that competitiveness was harmful, and that traditional expectations placed upon them were relics of a past that needed to be erased. Many men listened. They internalized the message. They adjusted, they retreated. And in doing so, they discovered something unexpected: peace. When the pressure to perform for a system that openly criticized them disappeared, many men found that their stress levels dropped, their expenses decreased, and their need for external validation vanished. They simplified their lives. They learned to live below their means. They focused on hobbies, personal interests, fitness, and quiet routines. They built small, controlled worlds that did not demand constant sacrifice for diminishing returns. While this withdrawal was happening, the systems that depended on male participation continued operating as if nothing had changed. Governments expanded spending. Institutions assumed constant productivity. Social narratives assumed endless compliance. But the foundation was already shifting. National debt exploded to levels that were once considered unthinkable. Entire economic models began relying on debt rather than production. At the same time, automation and artificial intelligence accelerated at a pace that displaced workers faster than most people expected. Ironically, many of the roles most vulnerable to automation were roles heavily occupied by women, particularly in administrative, communication, and routine processing fields. The same system that told men they were obsolete is now quietly replacing large segments of the workforce with algorithms, and the people most shocked by this are often the ones who believe the system would protect them. What makes this moment so unusual is not just the economic instability or technological disruption, but the emotional response to it. Historically, when societies faced crisis, men were expected to mobilize, to sacrifice, to rebuild, and to stabilize. That expectation still exists in theory, but it no longer exists in practice. The difference now is that men are no longer emotionally invested in the outcome. They are not rushing to rescue institutions that openly dismiss them. They are not volunteering to fix problems they were blamed for creating. Instead, many are watching from the sidelines with a sense of detachment that would have been unthinkable in previous generations. They are playing games, cooking their own meals, exercising, managing small investments, and maintaining modest lifestyles that shield them from much of the chaos. This detachment is often misinterpreted as apathy, but it is not apathy. It is a rational response to incentives. When effort is met with punishment, withdrawal becomes logical. When responsibility is paired with blame rather than respect, opting out becomes appealing. When contribution is framed as liability, non participation becomes the safest option. Men did not organize this withdrawal in secret meetings or online forums. It happened organically, quietly, and individually. Each man reached his own conclusion at his own pace, and together, those decisions created a collective outcome that no single policymaker seems willing to acknowledge. At the same time, social narratives have begun to shift in subtle but revealing ways. Stories are emerging about loneliness, about financial stress, about rising costs of living, and about the difficulty of maintaining stability in an increasingly unpredictable world. In many cases, the tone has changed from dismissal to concern. The same voices that once insisted men were unnecessary now ask where the support went. The same culture that encouraged independence now wonders why cooperation feels absent. But trust, once broken, is not easily restored. Men remember being told to stay away, to stop helping, to stop leading, and to stop engaging. They remember the consequences of stepping forward when they were not explicitly invited. And so they stay back, not out of spite, but out of self preservation. This is where the real tension lies because a society without engaged men does not collapse overnight. It erodes slowly. Infrastructure maintenance suffers. Community cohesion weakens. Long term planning gives way to short term fixes. Systems designed around the assumption of male overcontribution begin to strain when that contribution is no longer guaranteed. The result is not immediate disaster, but gradual decline, punctuated by moments of panic and confusion. And through it all, many men remain remarkably calm. They have already adjusted their expectations. They no longer believe they are responsible for saving the world. They believe they are responsible for managing their own lives and nothing more. What is most striking is how content many of these men appear. They are not chasing status. They are not trying to prove anything. They are not seeking approval. They are comfortable with solitude, comfortable with simplicity, and comfortable with being overlooked. This comfort is deeply unsettling to a culture that relies on male discomfort to fuel productivity and compliance. A man who is content with less is difficult to control. A man who does not need validation is difficult to manipulate. A man who has opted out of the game cannot be motivated by the usual incentives. And this, more than any protest or movement, is what truly signals a shift. We are watching the early stages of a new equilibrium, one where participation is optional rather than assumed. Whether society adapts to this reality or continues pretending it does not exist will determine what comes next. But one thing is already clear: the era of automatic male intervention is over. The assumption that men will always step in to stabilize systems that do not respect them is no longer valid. What replaces that assumption will shape the next several decades. and not everyone is prepared for the consequences of that change. To understand how we arrived at this point, you have to look backward before you can see forward. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. This did not begin with a single policy, a single movement, or a single cultural shift. It unfolded slowly, over decades, through countless small messages that added up to one very loud conclusion. Men were told that their instincts were outdated, that their competitive drive was dangerous, that their ambition was oppressive, and that their natural role as builders and protectors was something that needed to be restrained rather than guided. At the same time, they were still expected to provide stability, pay taxes, absorb risk, and quietly shoulder responsibility when things went wrong. The contradiction was never resolved. You cannot simultaneously tell a group that they are a problem and expect them to remain fully invested in maintaining the system that labels them that way. As these messages accumulated, many men began to disengage emotionally long before they disengaged physically. They stopped identifying with institutions. They stopped believing that hard work would necessarily be rewarded. They stopped trusting that sacrifice would be reciprocated. Instead, they began asking simpler, more practical questions. What do I actually need to live a stable life? How much money is enough? How much effort is worth giving if the return keeps shrinking? These questions led to different choices than previous generations made. Men downsized. They delayed or abandoned traditional milestones. They avoided debt. They reduced their exposure to volatile systems. They chose predictability over prestige. None of this made headlines because quiet withdrawal does not generate outrage, but it reshaped the foundation of society all the same. At the same time, the cost of living continued to rise, not because resources disappeared, but because systems became bloated and inefficient. Housing costs surged, food prices climbed, healthcare expenses expanded, education became more expensive while delivering less tangible value. Each of these pressures made participation more costly and less rewarding. For men who had already been told they were not essential, the question became obvious. Why keep paying into a system that does not seem to want you and that keeps asking for more while giving less? Opting out did not require anger, it only required arithmetic. What many people fail to grasp is that this withdrawal is not ideological. It is not driven by hatred or resentment in the way it is often portrayed. It is driven by a sense of finality. Men are not arguing anymore. They are not trying to convince anyone. They are not seeking validation for their choices. They have simply accepted the reality in front of them and adjusted accordingly. This is why attempts to shame or pressure men back into participation have been so ineffective. Shame only works when someone still cares about approval. Pressure only works when someone believes compliance will improve their situation. For a growing number of men, neither condition applies. The emotional tone of this shift matters. In previous eras, social disengagement was often loud and confrontational. Today, it is calm. Men are not burning bridges. They are quietly crossing them and not looking back. They are not demanding recognition. They are content with invisibility. This calm detachment is deeply destabilizing to systems built on constant engagement. It is much easier to rally against an angry group than it is to motivate a disengaged one. Anger can be redirected, detachment cannot. Meanwhile, the broader culture continues to operate under outdated assumptions. It assumes endless labor supply. It assumes consistent productivity growth. It assumes that when pressure increases, people will respond, by working harder. But what happens when people respond by working less? What happens when they decide the trade off is no longer worth it? What happens when survival no longer requires maximum participation? Automation and technology have lowered the threshold for basic stability, especially for individuals willing to live simply. This creates an environment where opting out is not only emotionally appealing, but materially feasible. This is why the conversation around artificial intelligence is so revealing. Much of the public discussion frames AI as a neutral or positive force that will free people from tedious work. But the reality is more complex. Automation does not distribute its benefits evenly. It replaces roles faster than it creates new ones, and the transition period is where instability emerges. Many men saw this coming years ago and adjusted early. They diversified income. They learned skills that could be monetized independently. They reduced reliance on traditional employment. Others simply lowered their expectations and expenses to match a reduced income. In either case, they prepared. Many institutions did not. The irony is that the same culture that encouraged men to disengage is now surprised by the consequences of that disengagement. Labor shortages appear, productivity slows, tax bases erode, social programs strain. The response is often to demand more participation rather than ask why participation declined in the first place. But demands without incentives fall flat. Men who have already found peace outside the system are unlikely to return simply because they are asked to, especially when the underlying attitudes toward them remain unchanged. This is where the generational divide becomes clear. Younger men, in particular, grew up watching older generations burn themselves out chasing stability that never quite arrived. They watched loyalty go unrewarded. They watched promises change. They watched institutions fail without accountability. For them, opting out does not feel rebellious. It feels practical. They are not trying to dismantle society. They are trying to avoid being crushed by it. If that means living smaller, slower, and quieter lives, many are perfectly comfortable with that trade. At the same time, expectations placed on men have not diminished. They have become more ambiguous. Men are still expected to be responsible, but not authoritative, supportive, but not directive, present, but not assertive, involved, but not influential. These contradictory expectations create a narrow behavioral corridor where missteps are heavily penalized and success is rarely acknowledged. Navigating that corridor requires constant self monitoring and restraint. For many men, stepping out of the corridor entirely is simply easier. What we are witnessing now is the lag between cause and effect. The cultural messages of the past 50 years are colliding with economic and technological realities in ways that cannot be ignored. A society that devalues its men cannot rely on them indefinitely. A system that discourages participation cannot expect loyalty. A culture that treats contribution as suspicious should not be surprised when contribution declines. These are not moral judgments, they are cause and effect relationships. The broader implications extend beyond economics. Social trust erodes when large segments of the population disengage. Community involvement declines. Informal mentorship disappears. Intergenerational knowledge transfer weakens. These losses are difficult to quantify, but they matter deeply. Societies are not held together by policies alone. They are held together by people who believe their presence matters. When that belief fades, the fabric loosens. What makes this moment particularly fragile is that many of the usual corrective mechanisms are no longer effective. Messaging campaigns feel hollow. Moral appeals fall flat. Economic incentives are blunted by inflation and instability. Threats of consequences lose power when individuals have already minimized their exposure. The tools that once mobilized men no longer work because the underlying relationship has changed. You cannot motivate someone who no longer believes the system represents them. And yet, despite all of this, there is remarkably little public acknowledgement of the scale of the shift. Discussions remain fragmented. Symptoms are addressed individually rather than collectively. Workforce participation is discussed without examining why people left. Economic stress is analyzed without questioning who is still willing to carry the burden. Cultural narratives continue to oscillate between blame and confusion, rarely stopping to reflect on accountability. The truth is uncomfortable. Men did not abandon society overnight. They were pushed, nudged, and discouraged over time. When they finally stepped back, the silence was mistaken for compliance rather than departure. Now that the effects are becoming visible, there is a scramble to understand what went wrong, but understanding requires honesty, and honesty requires acknowledging past mistakes. That conversation has barely begun. As we move forward, the question is not whether men will return to their previous role. That era is over. The question is whether a new equilibrium can be formed that respects autonomy, values contribution, and aligns incentives with reality. That outcome is still possible, but it requires a fundamental shift in perspective. It requires seeing men not as a resource to be extracted, but as individuals who choose whether or not to participate. It requires recognizing that respect is not a slogan, but a practice demonstrated through consistent action. Until that shift occurs, the trend will continue. More men will opt out, more systems will strain, more contradictions will surface, and more people will ask how things unraveled so quickly, unaware that the unraveling began decades ago, quietly, one message at a time. One of the most misunderstood aspects of what is happening right now is the assumption that men are waiting for permission to re engage, or that they are secretly hoping society will change its tone so they can step back in. For many, that stage has already passed. The emotional detachment that defines this moment is not temporary, it is the result of closure. When someone reaches closure, they stop negotiating internally. They stop revisiting old arguments. They stop imagining alternative outcomes. They accept reality as it is and move forward accordingly. That is where a growing number of men are right now. They are not angry and they are not bitter. They are resolved. And resolution is far more difficult to reverse than frustration. This resolution reshapes how men view time, effort, and obligation. Long term planning now revolves around personal sustainability rather than collective advancement. Men are optimizing for low stress rather than high status. They are choosing consistency over growth. They are prioritizing peace over recognition. These choices are rational responses to an environment that has repeatedly demonstrated that visibility comes with risk and that contribution does not guarantee security. When effort becomes unpredictable and reward becomes uncertain, reducing exposure is the most logical strategy. This is why many men no longer feel urgency when headlines announce crises. Economic downturns, political instability, institutional failures, and social upheaval no longer trigger the same impulse to intervene. The emotional distance acts as insulation. Men have already recalibrated their expectations downward, so shocks feel less destabilizing. When you are no longer invested in outcomes you cannot control, volatility loses its power. This does not mean men want collapse. It means they are no longer willing to sacrifice themselves to prevent it. This emotional insulation is reinforced by changes in daily life. Technology allows for self contained routines that previous generations could not have imagined. Entertainment, education, communication, and even income generation can now be managed independently. The need for constant social integration has diminished. Men can meet their needs without navigating complex social hierarchies or institutional gatekeeping. This autonomy is quiet but profound. It shifts the balance of power away from systems that rely on compulsory participation. As a result, attempts to reframe narratives often miss the mark. When messaging focuses on guilt, obligation, or moral duty, it fails because it assumes men still see themselves as stakeholders. Many no longer do. When messaging emphasizes inclusion without addressing past exclusion, it rings hollow. Inclusion without accountability feels performative. When messaging promises future change without demonstrating present action, it feels speculative. Men have learned to evaluate promises based on outcomes, not intentions. This is especially evident in discussions about relationships and family formation. Traditional incentives have weakened. Legal and financial structures often place disproportionate risk on men while offering diminishing emotional or social returns. Many men have observed this and adjusted accordingly. They are not hostile toward relationships, they are cautious. They understand the cost of failure and the lack of protection if things go wrong. For a system to encourage participation, it must offer symmetry. When risk is asymmetric, participation declines. The broader cultural reaction to this caution often oscillates between confusion and criticism. Men are told they are avoiding responsibility or failing to grow up, but responsibility without authority and risk without protection are not signs of maturity. They are signs of imbalance, and men are not rejecting responsibility. They are rejecting vulnerability without reciprocity. They are rejecting systems that demand sacrifice without offering stability. This dynamic extends into governance as well. Democratic systems rely on engagement, trust, and belief in shared purpose. When a significant portion of the population disengages emotionally, these systems weaken. Voter turnout declines. Civic participation shrinks. Public discourse becomes increasingly polarized as moderate voices withdraw. Men who feel alienated are less likely to advocate, organize, or compromise, not because they oppose the system, but because they no longer believe it reflects them. At the same time, policy responses often focus on surface level metrics rather than underlying causes. Workforce participation is measured, but motivation is not. Employment rates are tracked, but satisfaction is ignored. Economic output is prioritized, but human buy in is assumed. This creates blind spots that widen over time. And a system can appear functional on paper while eroding in practice. By the time dysfunction becomes visible, reversal becomes difficult. What is rarely discussed openly is how much modern society depends on men operating beyond their own self interest. Historically, men were socialized to endure discomfort for the sake of stability. They worked longer hours, accepted higher risk, and prioritized provision over personal fulfillment. That model functioned because it was reinforced by respect, purpose, and social recognition. When those reinforcements disappear, the model collapses. You cannot extract sacrifice indefinitely without replenishing meaning. This is where the concept of social contracts becomes relevant. A social contract is not static, it evolves based on expectations and outcomes. When one side believes the contract has been broken, participation declines. Men increasingly feel that the terms have changed without their consent, and responsibilities remained, but benefits eroded. Expectations expanded, but protections shrank. In response, men renegotiated individually rather than collectively. They withdrew consent by withdrawing effort. This individual renegotiation is why the shift is difficult to counter. There is no single movement to address, no centralized leadership to engage, and no unified demands to meet. Each man has his own reasons, his own calculations, and his own thresholds. Addressing this requires systemic change, not messaging campaigns. It requires restoring balance, not rebranding narratives. Another layer to this story involves how success is defined. For decades, success was measured through external markers like income, status, and visibility. Many men pursued these markers at significant personal cost. Today, a different metric is emerging. Success is defined as autonomy, stability, and peace. This redefinition alters behavior dramatically. When success no longer requires constant striving, opting out becomes a valid path rather than a failure. This shift also explains why many men are uninterested in public debates about identity or ideology. These debates feel disconnected from practical outcomes. Men are focused on tangible results. Does this improve my life? Does this reduce risk? Does this increase stability? If the answer is no, engagement feels unnecessary. This pragmatic filtering leads to selective participation rather than blanket involvement. Critics often interpret this selectivity as selfishness, but self preservation is not selfishness. It is a survival strategy in environments perceived as hostile or unreliable. Men are not hoarding resources or exploiting systems. They are minimizing exposure. They are choosing sustainability over sacrifice. This distinction matters because mischaracterizing motivations leads to ineffective responses. The long term consequences of this trend are still unfolding. Labor markets will continue to adapt, automation will accelerate, institutional legitimacy will be tested, social cohesion will fluctuate. Some systems will adjust and survive, others will fracture. Throughout this process, men who have already disengaged will experience less disruption because they have already adapted. Those who remain fully invested may feel the strain more acutely. What makes this moment pivotal is that it represents a turning point rather than a temporary deviation. The cultural conditions that produce this withdrawal are deeply embedded. Reversing the trend would require rebuilding trust at scale, realigning incentives, and demonstrating consistent respect over time. That is a long process, not a quick fix. Until it begins in earnest, the default trajectory remains unchanged. This does not mean the future is bleak. It means the future will be different. Societies evolve when assumptions fail. The assumption that men will always step in regardless of how they are treated is failing. What replaces that assumption will define the next era. Whether that replacement is healthier and more balanced or more fragmented and unstable depends on choices that are being made right now, often without full awareness of their consequences. When you widen the lens beyond any single country, the pattern becomes even clearer. This is not an isolated phenomenon confined to one economy or one cultural moment. Variations of the same withdrawal are appearing across much of the developed world and in regions that have adopted similar social and economic frameworks. Workforce participation among men is declining in multiple countries. Marriage rates are falling. Birth rates are dropping below replacement levels. Long term commitments of every kind are being delayed or abandoned. These trends are often discussed separately, but they are deeply connected. At the center of all of them is a recalculation of cost versus reward, risk versus return, effort versus outcome. Globalization promised efficiency and opportunity, but it also diluted accountability. Decisions that once had local consequences now have distant origins. Workers feel replaceable. Loyalty feels one sided. Stability feels conditional. In that environment, men adapted the same way people always do when systems become unreliable. They reduced dependence. They simplified. They diversified where possible. Or they disengaged where diversification was not feasible. This is not ideological resistance. It is practical adaptation to uncertainty. Demographics amplify this effect. Aging populations increase the burden on those still participating. Fewer workers are expected to support more dependents. Taxes rise, services strain, expectations increase. For men already questioning the value of participation, this intensifies the calculation. Why invest more into systems that appear structurally unsustainable? Why commit to long term obligations when the rules can change midstream? These questions are not pessimistic, they are rational responses to observed trends. At the same time, cultural narratives often frame declining participation as a moral failure rather than a structural outcome. Men are told they lack motivation, ambition, or resilience. But motivation does not exist in a vacuum. It emerges from alignment between effort and reward. When alignment breaks down, motivation fades. This is not a character flaw, it is feedback. Ignoring that feedback does not restore motivation, it deepens disengagement. The changing nature of work further complicates the picture. Many jobs today are less tangible than those of previous generations. Output is abstract, impact is diffuse, purpose is harder to see. Men who once took pride in building, fixing, and producing now find themselves navigating roles that feel detached from real world outcomes. When work loses its sense of contribution, it becomes harder to justify sacrifice. This is especially true when compensation fails to offset rising living costs. Remote work and digital platforms have accelerated this detachment. While they offer flexibility, they also reduce social cohesion. Colleagues become avatars, teams become temporary, loyalty weakens. For men who already feel disconnected, these environments offer little incentive to engage deeply. It becomes easier to treat work as transactional rather than identity forming. Once work loses its identity function, opting out becomes less disruptive psychologically. This shift has ripple effects across social life. Community organizations struggle to recruit volunteers. Informal leadership roles go unfilled. Mentorship declines. Younger generations lack role models not because men are absent, but because they are disengaged. The transfer of practical wisdom slows. Skills that were once passed down informally are lost. This erosion happens quietly, without dramatic events, but its impact accumulates over time. Another underdiscussed factor is how risk has been redistributed. Men are still expected to absorb risk, but they are offered fewer safeguards. Legal frameworks, economic volatility, and social scrutiny increase the downside of participation while limiting upside. In such an environment, rational actors reduce exposure. Men are not avoiding responsibility, they are avoiding asymmetric risk. They are choosing situations where they control variables rather than ones where outcomes depend on shifting norms and external judgments. This is why appeals to nostalgia are ineffective. Calls to return to previous models ignore the conditions that made those models viable. You cannot recreate past participation without restoring past incentives. Respect, stability, and reciprocity were not symbolic. They were functional components of social cohesion. Remove them, and participation declines. Reintroducing slogans without substance does nothing to reverse the trend. The emotional resilience men display in this withdrawal is often mistaken for indifference. In reality, it reflects adaptation. Humans are remarkably good at adjusting to new baselines. When expectations drop, satisfaction recalibrates. Men who once chased ambition now find contentment in predictability. Men who once sought approval now value autonomy. These shifts are not signs of defeat, they are signs of recalibration. What unsettles institutions is that this recalibration is difficult to counter. You cannot force someone to want more. You cannot compel ambition. You cannot mandate emotional investment. Those qualities emerge organically when conditions support them. Without those conditions, systems must operate with reduced participation, which changes everything from economic growth to cultural output. And the tension becomes most visible during crises. Natural disasters, economic shocks, and institutional failures reveal who is still willing to step forward. Increasingly, the burden falls on a shrinking pool of participants. Burnout accelerates, resentment grows, systems strain. The absence of widespread male engagement is felt not as a single gap, but as 1,000 small failures to respond. Repairs take longer. Coordination weakens. Recovery slows. Yet, even in these moments, many men remain distant, not because they enjoy chaos, but because they no longer see themselves as guardians of systems that dismiss them. This detachment is self reinforcing. The more systems strain, the less attractive participation becomes. The less participation occurs, the more systems strain. Breaking the cycle requires more than appeals. It requires rebuilding trust at a fundamental level. Trust, once lost, returns slowly. It requires consistent behavior over time. It requires accountability for past actions. It requires tangible changes rather than promises. For men who have already moved on emotionally, this process may arrive too late. They have built lives that do not depend on institutional stability. They have learned to operate independently. They are unlikely to reattach simply because conditions improve marginally. This reality forces an uncomfortable question. What does a society look like when a large segment of its men choose minimal participation? The answer is not immediate collapse, but transformation. Growth slows, innovation shifts, social norms adjust, expectations recalibrate. Some structures shrink, others disappear. New forms of organization emerge. The transition period is marked by friction and uncertainty. One possible outcome is a more decentralized society where individuals rely less on large institutions and more on small networks. Another is increased automation to compensate for reduced human input. Another is rising inequality between those who remain engaged and those who opt out. Each path carries risks and trade offs. None restore the past. What remains constant is that ignoring the root causes only prolongs instability. Blaming individuals does not address structural incentives. Shaming disengagement does not restore motivation. Only genuine recalibration can change the trajectory. That recalibration would require acknowledging that men are not an infinite resource. They are participants by choice, not obligation. One of the most revealing consequences of the shift is how cultural narratives are beginning to fracture under their own weight. For years, stories about progress followed a familiar structure. Society identified a problem, assigned responsibility, mobilized effort, and celebrated improvement. Men were often positioned as the engine behind that mobilization, whether explicitly acknowledged or not. Today, that structure no longer holds. Responsibility is still assigned, problems still identified, but mobilization increasingly fails to materialize. The story assumes an ending that no longer arrives, and the gap between expectation and reality grows wider with each passing year. Media plays a powerful role in this disconnect. Popular narratives continue to portray men as either omnipresent obstacles or invisible background figures, rarely as complex participants whose choices are shaped by incentives. When men disengage, the explanation offered is often moral rather than structural. They are said to lack purpose, direction, or resilience. Rarely is the question asked whether the environment itself has become inhospitable to sustained engagement. This framing matters because stories shape perception and perception shapes policy. When disengagement is treated as a personal failing, solutions focus on correction rather than reform. At the same time, storytelling around independence and empowerment has evolved unevenly. Autonomy is celebrated in theory, but discouraged in practice when it leads to reduced participation. Men are encouraged to find themselves, prioritize well being, and reject harmful expectations until those choices result in stepping back from systems that depend on their labor and compliance. Then, autonomy is recast as irresponsibility. This contradiction, undermines credibility. You cannot praise independence while punishing its logical outcomes. The result is narrative fatigue. Men hear the same messages repeated with diminishing resonance. Calls to care more, do more, and give more land differently when past contributions were met with criticism rather than appreciation. Over time, disengagement becomes not just a choice, but an identity. Men begin to see themselves as observers rather than actors, commentators rather than participants. This identity shift is subtle but profound. Once someone no longer sees themselves as part of the story, they stop responding to its demands. This detachment also influences how men consume information. They become selective, they filter out noise, they disengage from debates that feel performative rather than practical. This selective attention further isolates them from mainstream discourse, creating parallel realities where different assumptions operate. In one reality, participation is still expected and assumed. In the other, participation is optional and conditional. The friction between these realities creates misunderstanding on both sides. Another underexamined consequence is how this shift affects innovation and risk taking. Historically, societies relied on men to take disproportionate risks, whether economic, physical, or social. Risk fueled exploration, entrepreneurship, and infrastructure development. When men become risk averse, not because of fear, but because of calculation, innovation slows. Not because ideas disappear, but because the willingness to absorb failure declines. In environments where failure is punished rather than treated as a learning process, rational actors avoid risk. This avoidance is not limited to business, it extends to social interaction, leadership roles, and public engagement. Men increasingly avoid situations where misinterpretation or misalignment can have outsized consequences. The cost of being wrong has risen, while the reward for being right has diminished. In such an environment, the safest move is often no move at all. Over time, this leads to stagnation, not dramatic collapse, but gradual inertia. Education systems reflect this tension as well. Boys and young men often disengage early, not because they lack ability, but because they struggle to see relevance. Curricula emphasize abstract outcomes and social messaging while downplaying tangible skill development. Men who thrive on practical application and measurable progress feel alienated. They disengage quietly, doing just enough to pass through systems they do not believe will serve them. This disengagement compounds over time, producing adults who feel disconnected from institutions long before they enter the workforce. As these patterns repeat across generations, the cumulative effect becomes difficult to ignore. Fewer men invest in long term social projects. Fewer see value in institutional loyalty. Fewer believe that participation guarantees dignity. These beliefs are not formed in isolation, they are learned through observation, through watching how others are treated, through seeing effort met with skepticism rather than respect. Culture teaches through example, not instruction. This brings us to a critical point. Societies often assume resilience is infinite. They assume people will adapt indefinitely without breaking, but resilience has limits. It depends on recovery, recognition, and renewal. When resilience is treated as obligation rather than capacity, burnout becomes inevitable. Men have responded to this by opting out before burnout occurs. They have chosen preservation over exhaustion. This choice is rational, but it carries systemic consequences. Those consequences are now visible in the tone of public discourse. There is a growing sense of confusion about why certain initiatives fail to gain traction, why volunteer numbers are low, why leadership pipelines are thinning, why trust in institutions continues to decline. These outcomes are often discussed as separate crises, but they share a common root. Yet our disengagement is not random, it is patterned, it follows incentives. What complicates efforts to reverse this trend is that many of the traditional motivators no longer apply. Financial incentives are eroded by inflation, social incentives are weakened by mistrust, moral incentives are blunted by perceived hypocrisy. Without credible motivators, participation becomes sporadic at best. Systems that rely on steady input struggle to adapt to intermittent engagement. There is also a psychological dimension that is rarely acknowledged. When men disengage, they often experience an initial sense of relief, followed by a quieter form of contentment. Life becomes simpler. Decisions carry fewer external consequences. Time feels less compressed. This lived experience reinforces the choice to opt out. It becomes self validating. The longer men remain disengaged, the less appealing reentry becomes. This creates a feedback loop that is difficult to interrupt. Disengagement reduces system performance. Reduced performance increases frustration among remaining participants. Frustration leads to harsher rhetoric and increased pressure. Pressure further discourages reentry. Each cycle tightens the loop. Breaking it requires interrupting the pattern at its source rather than reacting to its symptoms. One potential response is genuine decentralization. Smaller, more responsive systems can rebuild trust more effectively than large, impersonal institutions. When individuals see a direct connection between effort and outcome, engagement increases. Men are more likely to participate in environments where their contributions are visible and valued. This suggests that the future may favor localized networks over centralized structures. Another response involves redefining success and contribution in ways that align with contemporary realities. Not all participation needs to look like full time employment or formal leadership. Contribution can take many forms, including mentorship, craftsmanship, and independent production. Recognizing and respecting these forms requires cultural adjustment. It requires letting go of outdated metrics and embracing diversity of participation styles. However, these adjustments challenge existing power structures. Centralized systems benefit from standardization and predictability. Decentralized engagement is harder to manage and control. This tension will shape the next phase of societal evolution. Whether systems adapt or resist will determine how much disengagement accelerates. What is clear is that pretending nothing has changed is no longer viable. The signs are too consistent, the patterns too widespread. Men are not temporarily absent, they are intentionally distant. They are not waiting to be called back. They are building lives that function without constant institutional involvement. This is the reality that must be confronted honestly. As narratives struggle to keep pace with lived experience, the risk is that trust erodes further. When stories no longer match reality, credibility suffers. People disengage not just from systems, but from shared meaning itself. This fragmentation makes collective action increasingly difficult. Without shared narratives, coordination falters. Yet, even in this fragmentation, there is opportunity. Periods of transition often produce new models that better align with human needs. The withdrawal of men exposes flaws that were previously masked by overcontribution. Addressing those flaws requires humility and willingness to change. It requires listening rather than lecturing. It requires acknowledging that participation is earned, not owed. To understand the depth of this transformation, you have to move past statistics and systems and look at what is happening internally for the men who have chosen disengagement. On the surface, their lives may appear quieter, smaller, or even uneventful by traditional standards, but beneath that calm is a profound psychological shift. Many men describe a sense of mental spaciousness that did not exist before. When expectations fall away, When constant evaluation ends, and when the pressure to perform for external approval disappears, the mind settles. This is not emptiness, it is relief. The absence of constant demand allows men to reconnect with their own rhythms, preferences, and limits in ways that were previously impossible. This internal recalibration often begins with exhaustion. Years of striving, adapting, apologizing, and self monitoring take a toll. Men reach a point where continuing feels unsustainable. Stepping back is not framed as a philosophical decision at first. It feels like rest. Over time, that rest becomes a new baseline. Men realize how much of their previous effort went toward managing perception rather than producing value. Once that realization sets in, returning to the old pace feels unnecessary and even irrational. As men settle into this new baseline, their sense of identity changes. Identity becomes less performative and more internal. Instead of defining themselves by titles, roles, or external validation, men begin to define themselves by routines, competencies, and personal standards. They measure success privately rather than publicly. This internalization of identity makes them less responsive to external incentives. Praise loses power. Criticism loses sting. The emotional hooks that once pulled men into collective narratives lose their grip. This shift has important implications for mental health. Contrary to popular assumptions, disengagement does not automatically lead to despair or isolation. For many men, it reduces anxiety. The constant vigilance required to navigate complex social expectations fades. Decision making becomes simpler. Social interactions become more intentional. Men choose when and how to engage rather than reacting by default. This autonomy supports psychological stability, even if it comes at the cost of reduced visibility. However, this stability is often misunderstood by those still operating under older assumptions. A man who is calm and detached may be labeled apathetic or unmotivated. In reality, he may be highly motivated toward a different set of goals. The problem is not lack of drive, but misalignment between individual priorities and societal expectations. When those expectations fail to adjust, misunderstanding deepens. Another important internal change involves how men relate to responsibility. Disengagement does not eliminate responsibility, it reframes it. Men become highly responsible for their own well being, finances, and time. What they reject is diffuse responsibility for systems they cannot influence. This distinction matters. Taking responsibility for what you control while refusing responsibility for what you do not is a form of maturity, not avoidance. Yet this nuance is often lost in public discourse. Over time, this reframing produces a quiet confidence. Men who have opted out know where they stand. They are no longer pulled in multiple directions by conflicting demands. Their lives may be simpler, but they are coherent. Coherence is psychologically powerful. It reduces internal conflict and increases resilience. Men who achieve this coherence are difficult to destabilize emotionally, which further reduces their susceptibility to pressure. This internal stability also explains why many men show little interest in re entering traditional social roles, even when conditions improve slightly. Once a man has reorganized his life around peace and predictability, reintroducing volatility feels unnecessary. The burden of proof shifts. Instead of asking men to justify disengagement, systems must justify reentry. They must demonstrate that participation offers genuine value rather than symbolic inclusion. The effects of this internal transformation extend into how men relate to others. Relationships become more selective. Men invest time and energy where reciprocity is clear. They avoid dynamics that feel transactional or unbalanced. This selectivity reduces conflict, but also reduces reach. Men maintain smaller social circles, but those circles are more stable. Quantity gives way to quality. From the outside, this can look like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like refinement. And this refinement also affects communication styles. Men become more direct, not because they are confrontational, but because they are no longer interested in managing impressions. They say less, but mean more. They avoid debates that go nowhere. They disengage from conversations that feel circular. Silence becomes a tool rather than a void. This economy of expression further distances them from spaces that thrive on constant engagement and performative dialogue. As these patterns spread, they influence collective dynamics in subtle ways. Public spaces become louder as quieter participants exit. Discourse skews toward extremes as moderating voices withdraw. Institutions mistake this noise for engagement and adjust accordingly, further alienating those who value substance over spectacle. The result is a widening gap between how systems operate and how many men experience the world. This gap is particularly evident in how success stories are told. Media continues to celebrate high achievers who embody relentless ambition and constant hustle. But these stories resonate less with men who have opted out. They see such narratives as exceptions rather than models. The cost of that level of engagement appears too high and the payoff too uncertain. As a result, aspirational messaging loses effectiveness. Instead, men draw inspiration from quieter examples. Individuals who live within their means, maintain control over their time, and avoid unnecessary stress become role models even if they are invisible to mainstream narratives. These examples reinforce the idea that success does not require maximum participation. It requires alignment between values and behavior. This internal realignment also reshapes how men view the future. Long term planning becomes conservative. Men prioritize resilience over growth. They prepare for uncertainty rather than betting on stability. This mindset favors adaptability over expansion. It reduces vulnerability to shocks, but also limits collective ambition. Societies that rely on optimism and expansion struggle when large segments adopt precautionary stances. The emotional tone of this future orientation is worth noting. It is not despair, it is acceptance. Men are not predicting collapse with alarm, they are acknowledging instability with calm. This calm is unsettling to those who expect urgency, but urgency requires belief that action will make a difference. When belief fades, urgency fades with it. This brings us to a difficult truth. Many men no longer believe that their participation meaningfully influences large scale outcomes. They feel interchangeable within systems that do not recognize individual contribution. When agency disappears, motivation follows. Rebuilding agency requires more than reassurance, it requires structural change that restores a sense of impact. Until that happens, men will continue to invest inward rather than outward. They will focus on personal mastery rather than public influence. They will choose stability over scale. This inward focus is not inherently negative, but it changes the character of society. Collective projects become harder to sustain. Shared risks become harder to justify. Coordination becomes more fragile. Yet within this inward turn lies potential. Men who are grounded internally can contribute in new ways if given the opportunity. Their disengagement is not a rejection of value creation, it is a rejection of misaligned systems. If environments emerge that respect autonomy, reward contribution fairly, and limit arbitrary risk, engagement could return in different forms. The challenge is timing. Internal transformations are easier to initiate than to reverse. Once men have reorganized their lives around disengagement, re engagement requires significant incentive. Small improvements will not suffice. Trust must be rebuilt slowly and consistently. Respect must be demonstrated through action, not language. And stability must be credible, not promised. The final piece of the story lies with the generation that is coming of age right now because they are not disengaging in response to disappointment, they are opting out by default. Younger men have grown up observing instability as a constant rather than an exception. They watched institutions fail publicly and repeatedly. They saw promises revised, systems patched instead of repaired, and accountability diluted. They did not experience a golden age followed by decline. Their baseline expectation has always been uncertainty. As a result, their relationship to society is fundamentally different from that of older generations. For many young men, traditional pathways never felt trustworthy to begin with. Education appeared expensive and disconnected from outcomes. Careers seemed fragile and transactional. Long term commitments felt risky rather than rewarding. These perceptions were not formed in isolation, they were learned through observation. Young men watched older peers struggle despite doing everything they were told was correct. They watched effort fail to guarantee security. They internalized those lessons early and adjusted accordingly. This adjustment manifests as skepticism rather than rebellion. Younger men are not loudly rejecting institutions, they are quietly bypassing them. They seek skills over credentials, flexibility over loyalty, independence over integration. This mindset does not come from cynicism, it comes from pattern recognition. When systems demonstrate volatility, rational actors seek optionality. Young men are building lives with fewer fixed commitments and lower overhead. They are designing their lives to absorb shocks rather than avoid them. Technology enables this approach. Access to information, tools, and global networks allows young men to learn independently, earn independently, and live independently in ways that were previously impossible. This independence weakens the leverage institutions once held. Participation is no longer required for survival. That alone changes everything. When participation becomes optional, systems must compete for engagement rather than assume it. What unsettles many observers is that this generation does not appear distressed by its choices. Young men are often portrayed as lost or directionless, but many report feeling grounded and pragmatic. They are not chasing ideals they do not believe in. They are optimizing for sustainability. They are realistic about trade offs. They know what they are giving up and they consider it acceptable. This calm acceptance challenges narratives that frame disengagement as a crisis of purpose rather than a redefinition of purpose. This generational shift accelerates trends already underway. As older men disengage after disillusionment and younger men disengage by design, the pool of fully invested participants shrinks from both ends. Systems built on continuous inflow of motivated contributors struggle to adapt. Recruitment becomes harder, retention becomes fragile, institutional memory weakens. These pressures compound over time. Attempts to reverse this through messaging often miss the mark because they speak to values that no longer resonate. Appeals to legacy, duty, or collective destiny assume shared belief in those concepts. Younger men are not hostile to them, but they do not prioritize them. They prioritize autonomy, transparency, and fairness. Without those elements, appeals feel abstract and unconvincing. This creates a cultural lag. Institutions continue operating on outdated assumptions while the population they depend on has moved on. Policies are crafted for a world that no longer exists. Narratives are repeated that no longer persuade. The resulting friction produces confusion rather than clarity. Everyone senses something is wrong, but few agree on why. At this stage, it is important to clarify what this moment is not. It is not a coordinated movement. It is not an ideological campaign. It is not a rejection of cooperation or community. It is a withdrawal of unconditional participation. Men are not refusing to contribute, they are refusing to be taken for granted. They are not rejecting society. They are rejecting imbalance. This distinction matters because it shapes the path forward. A society that treats disengagement as hostility will respond defensively. A society that recognizes disengagement as feedback has a chance to adapt. Feedback, however, requires listening. It requires acknowledging discomfort rather than dismissing it. It requires examining incentives honestly rather than protecting narratives. There is still a window for recalibration. Systems can evolve, relationships can rebalance, trust can be rebuilt. But this process will not be quick and it will not be easy. It requires consistent behavior over time. It requires aligning responsibility with authority and risk with reward. It requires treating men as partners rather than utilities. If this recalibration does not occur, the trajectory remains clear. More men will disengage, more will build parallel lives outside traditional structures. Society will continue functioning, but with reduced cohesion, slower recovery, and thinner margins. The cost of instability will be borne by those still fully invested. The distance between participants and observers will widen. Ironically, many men are at peace with this outcome. They have already adjusted their expectations. They are not waiting for validation or rescue. They are living their lives quietly, intentionally, and on their own terms. They are not watching collapse with glee. They are watching it with detachment. A detachment earned through years of being told to step back, stand down, and stay silent. This is the part of the story that unsettles people the most. Not anger, not protest, but indifference. A society can negotiate with anger. It can repress protest, but indifference is immune to pressure. Indifference signals that the emotional contract has already ended. The question now is not whether men will return to the roles they once occupied. That chapter is closed. The question is whether new roles can emerge that reflect current realities rather than past expectations. Whether participation can be reimagined as a choice rather than an obligation. Whether respect can be restored through action rather than rhetoric. If that happens, engagement may return in new forms, smaller, more localized, more intentional, less extractive, more reciprocal. If it doesn't, the quiet withdrawal will continue and society will adapt around it, whether it acknowledges it or not. What we are witnessing is not the end of society, but the end of an assumption. The assumption that men will always show up no matter how they are treated, no matter how little they are valued, no matter how high the cost. That assumption no longer holds, and everything built on it must now adjust. So the next time someone asks why men are not stepping forward, not intervening, not saving the day, the answer is simpler than most people want to admit. Men listen. They were told to step back. They did. And in that space, they found something they had not felt in a long time: peace. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what we discussed in this video? Do you agree with this assessment or do you see it differently? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because this conversation matters and it is not going away. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.